She was arguing with a basket of apples. Not loudly. Not in a way anyone else would have noticed, but I had been standing 3 stalls away for almost a minute, pretending to study homemade strawberry jam, and I could tell she was losing patience with fruit. She picked up one apple, turned it over in her hand, frowned, put it back, then reached for another, like the first one had somehow disappointed her personally. And the ridiculous thing was, I knew exactly who she was. I just wasn't sure whether walking over to say hello was the worst idea I'd had in years. My name is Ethan Parker. I'm 35 years old, and until 3 years ago, I was married to her daughter. The marriage hadn't exploded. There had been no betrayal, no screaming matches, no dramatic goodbye in the rain. Claire wanted a different life. She had accepted a promotion in Seattle, and I had spent too many years building my architecture business in our hometown to start over somewhere else. We tried long distance. Then we tried pretending long distance was working. Eventually, we admitted what both of us already knew. We loved each other. We just didn't belong in the same future. The divorce had been quiet, painful, but quiet. Claire remarried last year. I sent a polite message. She thanked me. That was the end of our story, or at least I thought it was. Because on a cool October Saturday morning, while I was buying vegetables I probably didn't need, I looked across the farmer's market and saw her mother, Margaret Lawson, 57, elegant without trying to be. Silver hair gathered loosely at the back of her head. A dark burgundy sweater, black jeans, simple leather boots, she carried herself with the kind of calm confidence that only comes from surviving enough disappointments to stop worrying about impressing anyone. I had met her maybe 6 or 7 times during my marriage. Christmas dinners, birthdays. One unforgettable afternoon when she had quietly helped me repair a fence while everyone else argued inside the house. She had always been kind. Never fake, never overly familiar. Just honest. She still hadn't noticed me. The market around us was alive with conversations, fresh bread, roasted coffee, and the smell of wet autumn leaves. People laughed. Children ran between the stalls. A musician somewhere behind me was playing an old folk song on a guitar that had probably seen better days. And there I was, holding a paper cup of coffee and staring at my ex-mother-in-law while she inspected apples like they were making life-changing decisions. A sensible man would have smiled, nodded from a distance, and kept walking. Unfortunately, I've never been as sensible as people think I am. I put the coffee down on the nearest table and started walking toward her. She noticed me when I was only a few steps away. For a second, her expression didn't change. Then her eyes widened just enough to tell me she had recognized me. Ethan? I smiled awkwardly. Hi, Margaret. She looked at me for another moment before a small, genuine smile appeared. Well, this is unexpected. I was about to say the same thing. She laughed softly. I suppose that's what happens when two people shop at the same farmer's market for years without knowing it. I didn't know you came here. I usually come early. She lifted the basket in her hand. The good honey disappears if you're late. I glanced at the jar she was carrying. So you're responsible for buying all the good stuff. And you're responsible for standing there making me feel guilty about taking the last one. I looked at the nearly empty shelf. I should have walked faster. She studied me for a second. You still drink coffee that's too hot? I blinked. What? She pointed toward the paper cup in my hand. You always did that. Claire would wait 5 minutes. You'd burn your tongue every single time. I laughed before I could stop myself. I honestly forgot anyone remembered that. Mothers remember strange things. The words were simple, but something about them carried a quiet sadness. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. The market buzzed around us. Someone nearby was selling fresh flowers. A little girl was trying to convince her father that they absolutely needed a pumpkin bigger than she was. The guitar player had started another song. It was peaceful, comfortably ordinary, which somehow made the situation even stranger. So, Margaret finally said, "How have you been?" It was the question everyone asks. Most people don't actually want the answer. But looking at her, I had the odd feeling that she did. I've been working too much, she nodded. I thought you might. And you? I retired from the school library last spring. I smiled. I can't imagine that place without you. Neither could I. She looked toward the next row of market stalls. The first month was wonderful. And after that? I realized I had absolutely no idea what to do with myself. I chuckled. I have the opposite problem. I always know what to do. And what is that? Work. She folded her arms. That's not living, Ethan. The fact that she used my first name instead of the polite distance we'd always kept caught me off guard. You sound exactly like Claire. Her smile faded just a little. No. She shook her head gently. I sound like someone who's old enough to know how quickly years disappear. The words stayed with me. We stood there for another second. Then she looked at the nearly empty coffee cup in my hand. I'm heading over to the bakery for fresh cinnamon rolls. She hesitated. And since we've already survived one awkward conversation, a small smile returned to her face. Would you like to join me for a coffee? I should have said no. It would have been simpler, safer. Instead, I heard myself answer, I'd like that. The bakery was exactly the kind of place I usually walked past without noticing. A narrow little shop on the edge of the market, fresh bread cooling by the window, shelves filled with pies and pastries, a small coffee counter tucked into the corner. Margaret seemed to know everyone. The young woman behind the counter smiled the moment she saw her. The usual? Margaret nodded. And 2 cinnamon rolls today. The girl looked at me. Oh, a playful smile crossed her face. So that's why Margaret sighed, Emily, don't start. The girl laughed and disappeared toward the kitchen. I raised an eyebrow. I'm almost afraid to ask. She thinks she knows everyone's business, and does she? Unfortunately, Margaret smiled, most of the time. We found a small table near the window. Outside, people wandered through the market carrying flowers, pumpkins, and paper bags filled with vegetables. For a while, neither of us spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable. It felt strangely familiar, as if we'd had coffee together 100 times before. The drinks arrived. I reached for my cup. Margaret watched me carefully. I took one sip, then immediately put the cup back down. She laughed. It's still too hot. I shook my head. This is embarrassing. No, her eyes sparkled. It's reassuring. Why? Because some things shouldn't change. The answer caught me off guard to escape the silence. I looked through the bakery window. Across the street stood a tiny second-hand bookshop. The old sign above the door leaned slightly to one side. You still read? I asked. She followed my eyes, almost every day. I remember. She looked surprised. You do? You gave me a book once. Her forehead wrinkled. I did? The first Christmas after Claire and I got married, you said every family should have at least one person who reads too much. A quiet smile appeared on her face. It was a Patrick O'Brien novel. I laughed. You remember, I remember giving it away. She looked down at her coffee. I didn't know you actually read it. I read all of them. Her eyes lifted to mine. Claire hated those books. I know. And you loved them? I nodded. She laughed softly. I spent years trying to convince my own daughter to read them. And then my son-in-law did. The words hung between us. Neither of us corrected them. Neither of us pointed out that I wasn't her son-in-law anymore. Outside, a gust of wind sent golden leaves dancing across the street. Margaret looked at the old bookshop. I haven't been in there for months. Why not? She shrugged. Some places are nicer with company. I should have recognized that moment for what it was, a simple invitation. Nothing dramatic, nothing improper, just two people with a quiet Saturday and nowhere important to be. Instead, I overthought it. Are you sure that wouldn't be? I stopped. She knew exactly what I meant. Complicated. I nodded. Margaret was silent for a second. Then she looked out the window. My daughter has a new life. She looked back at me. And you have yours. There was kindness in her voice, but there was loneliness too. She stood and picked up her coat. So, a small smile returned. Are we buying books? Or are we going to sit here pretending we're breaking some unwritten rule? For the second time that morning, I made the less sensible choice. I stood up and walked beside her toward the little bookshop on Willow Street. The bell above the bookshop door gave a soft little ring as we stepped inside. The place smelled of old paper, cedar wood, and coffee. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the walls. Books were stacked on tables, chairs, and even the windowsills. It looked less like a business and more like someone's lifelong habit had simply gotten out of control. An elderly man looked up from behind the counter. Margaret, she smiled. Good morning, Arthur. His eyes shifted toward me, then back to her. A slow grin appeared on his face. About time. Margaret closed her eyes. Oh, not you too. I look to be worried? Arthur chuckled. Only if she starts recommending poetry. I do not recommend poetry. The old man folded his newspaper. You gave me 3 books of poetry after my wife died. Margaret pointed toward the shelves. And you cried through all of them. I absolutely did. He looked at me. Best decision she ever made. Margaret shook her head and walked farther into the shop. I followed. You know everyone in this town, don't you? No. She ran her fingers gently across a row of old novels. I just stayed long enough for people to remember me. Something about that answer stayed with me. I had spent years moving from project to project, always planning the next thing. Margaret had done the opposite. She had built a life by staying. She stopped in front of a shelf. I think you'll like this. She pulled out an old hardcover book. The edges were worn, the cover had faded. I smiled. Another sea adventure? She looked offended. Absolutely not. It's history. It's history. History is simply adventure that already happened. I laughed. That's surprisingly convincing. I worked in a library for 30 years. I suppose you practiced. She handed me the book. As I opened it, something slipped from between the pages and floated to the floor, a folded piece of paper. I bent down and picked it up. I'm sorry. Margaret reached for it quickly. You don't need to. But I had already seen the handwriting. It wasn't mine. It wasn't Claire's. The paper was old, very old. I handed it back. You can keep reading if you want. She looked embarrassed. It's nothing important. I wasn't trying to invade her privacy, but she unfolded it anyway. The paper had yellowed with age. A small smile touched her face. My husband wrote this. I stayed quiet. He used to hide little notes inside library books. Her fingers traced the edges carefully. I would find them weeks later. What did he write? She looked down at the page, then she read it aloud. Life moves faster than we think it will. She paused. Promise me that if I'm ever gone, you'll still leave room in your life for happy surprises. The shop suddenly felt very quiet. Arthur had disappeared into the back room. Outside, rain had started to fall against the windows. Margaret folded the letter carefully. I was angry with him for writing that. Why? Because I thought he was being dramatic. She gave a small laugh. He died 3 months later. I didn't know what to say. Some moments don't need advice. They just need someone willing to stay. She slipped the note back inside the book. Then she looked at me. You know the strange thing? What? For years, I thought I'd already had all the happy surprises life was going to give me. She smiled softly. But today has been unexpectedly nice. For reasons I couldn't quite explain, I was very glad I had stopped to watch a woman argue with a basket of apples. Rain followed us out of the bookshop, not the heavy kind. Just a soft autumn drizzle that made the streets shine and sent people hurrying toward their cars. Margaret looked at the sky. I parked this way. I pointed toward the opposite side. So did I. For a second, we both laughed. The moment felt strangely familiar. Like two old friends who had forgotten they weren't supposed to know each other this well. Do you still have that little house outside Ashfield? I asked. She nodded. The one with the enormous garden? Her eyebrows lifted. You remember that? I remember spending an entire Saturday digging holes because Claire promised you it would only take an hour. Margaret smiled. It was a very optimistic estimate. It took 7, and you complained the whole time. I absolutely did. She folded her arms. You came back the next weekend. I laughed. I had blisters. You also planted 24 rose bushes. I was young and easily manipulated. Her smile grew warmer. No, she shook her head gently. You were kind. The words settled quietly between us. No one had called me that in a very long time. Work called me reliable. Clients called me professional. Friends called me practical. But kind. That was different. The garden survived, she said. Even the roses. I'm honestly surprised. I learned something. What? You can't rush living things. She looked toward the wet street. If you pull at them every day to make sure they're growing, you only damage the roots. I had a feeling we weren't talking about flowers anymore. She looked back at me. I still work out there every morning. By yourself, mostly. She smiled. I've developed strong opinions about tomatoes. I thought apples were your specialty. Oh no, she laughed softly. Tomatoes are much more difficult. The rain became a little heavier. People hurried past us carrying shopping bags and umbrellas. Margaret glanced at her watch. I should probably head home. I nodded. Of course, she took a few steps, then stopped, turned around. You know, I've spent years trying to grow vegetables, and I always end up with too many. I waited. My neighbors have reached the point where they hide when they see me carrying zucchini. I couldn't help smiling. That sounds serious. It is. She looked almost embarrassed. I was wondering, she paused, if you might like to help me with the garden one Saturday. I blinked. The garden. I promise not to make you plant you 24 rose bushes. She pretended to think about it. Perhaps 12. I laughed. I think that's still a trap. It probably is. The rain had dampened a few strands of silver hair near her face. She brushed them back almost absently. For the first time that morning, she looked uncertain. And somehow, that made her seem younger, not in age, in hope. You don't have to, she said quietly. I thought about my weekend, laundry, work reports, a grocery store, another quiet Saturday that would disappear into all the others. Then I thought about an old garden, fresh coffee, mud on my boots, and a woman who had once hidden memories inside library books. I'd like that, I said. Relief crossed her face so quickly she couldn't hide it. Good, she smiled. Come around 10. Then she started walking toward her car. After a few steps, she looked back over her shoulder. Oh, bring old clothes. I don't own gardening clothes. She laughed. You'll discover very quickly that the garden doesn't care. The following Saturday, I arrived at Margaret's house 10 minutes early. I told myself it was because I didn't know how long that drive would take. That wasn't true. The truth was, I had spent an embarrassing amount of time deciding which old clothes looked least like I'd chosen them carefully. Her house sat at the edge of Ashfield, surrounded by stone walls and old oak trees. It wasn't large, but it had the kind of quiet charm that only comes from being lived in for a long time. The garden was exactly as I remembered it, rows of vegetables, climbing roses, fruit trees near the back fence, and flower beds that somehow looked beautifully organized and completely natural at the same time. Margaret was already outside. She wore faded jeans, muddy boots, and a dark green gardening jacket. Her silver hair was tied back with a blue scarf. She looked up as I closed the gate. "You came." I said I would. She smiled, "I know." There was something comforting about that answer. No surprise, no awkwardness, just simple trust. She handed me a pair of gardening gloves. "I found these in the shed." I looked at them. "They're pink. They belong to Claire." For a second, neither of us moved. Then Margaret laughed softly. "I was testing you." She reached into a basket and handed me another pair. "These are yours." "Thank goodness." She looked at the pink gloves. "You know, you probably could have pulled them off." I'm choosing not to take that as a compliment. It was absolutely a compliment. The morning passed easily. We cleared weeds, moved flower pots, repaired a broken wooden border around one of the vegetable beds. The conversations came and went naturally. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we worked quietly. Neither of us seemed to mind the silence. Around noon, she disappeared into the house. When she returned, she was carrying 2 mugs of coffee and a small plate of homemade biscuits. "I should warn you," she said. "My baking is better than my gardening." I looked around the garden. "I think your tomatoes might disagree." She sat down on an old wooden bench. "My tomatoes think very highly of themselves." I sat beside her. The air smelled of damp earth and fresh herbs. Somewhere nearby, birds were making enough noise to suggest they had important opinions about the weather. Margaret wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "My husband built this bench." I looked at the old wood. "It still feels solid. He believed if you built something properly, it should outlive you." She smiled sadly. "He was usually right." I stayed quiet. She looked toward the garden. "When he died, I almost sold this house." "What changed your mind?" She took a slow breath. "I planted roses." I frowned. "Roses? I couldn't fix my life. I couldn't fix the grief, but I could put something in the ground and trust that one day it would bloom." The words settled over the garden. I looked at the rows of flowers. The vegetables, the trees, the little signs of care everywhere. "You built all this by yourself?" She shook her head. "No." She looked at me with a gentle smile. "I built it one morning at a time." A breeze moved through the garden, a few leaves drifted across the grass. Then she said something so quietly I almost missed it. "You know, I didn't expect to enjoy seeing you again this much." I looked down at the coffee in my hands because the truth was, I hadn't expected it either. And somewhere between the farmer's market, the little bookshop, and a garden full of roses, I had started thinking about Margaret far more often than I should have. By the third Saturday, helping in Margaret's garden had quietly become part of my routine. I stopped pretending I was there for the vegetables. The vegetables were terrible company. That morning, we spent an hour tying climbing roses to a wooden frame at the back of the garden. I was standing on a small ladder. Margaret was handing me pieces of twine. "Too tight," she said. "I thought flowers liked support." "They do." She smiled. "They don't like being trapped." I loosened the knot. "Better? Much." I looked down at her. "You know, you have a surprising number of life lessons hidden inside gardening." I had 30 years of children asking difficult questions. "You learn to improvise?" "I learned that the truth usually works better." I laughed. The ladder shifted slightly. She reached out automatically and held it steady. Her hand rested against the side for only a second. But somehow, I noticed it. When the work was finished, we walked to the old bench beneath the apple tree. She had brought sandwiches, homemade lemonade, and a blanket because the grass was still damp. "You planned this." "I like being prepared." "I've noticed." She looked at me with amusement. "You've also noticed that I buy too many apples and judge tomatoes unfairly. They know what they did." I laughed. The easy conversation faded. The kind silence that had become normal between us settled in. Margaret looked out across the garden. "Claire called yesterday." I felt something tighten inside my chest. "Oh, she's doing well. I'm glad." She asked if I'd met anyone. I looked at the ground. "And what did you say?" She took a slow sip of lemonade. "I said there was someone I enjoyed spending time with." The wind moved softly through the trees, birds fluttered between the branches, neither of us looked at the other. "How did she take it?" Margaret smiled sadly. "She asked if he treated me kindly." I let out a quiet breath, and I told her yes. There was a long silence. Then she turned toward me. "Ethan, yes? I don't want you to think I've forgotten who you are." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "You're my daughter's former husband, I know. And that matters." "I know." She folded her hands together. "I've spent weeks asking myself if this friendship is unfair." I didn't answer because I had been asking myself exactly the same question. She looked toward the roses. People died. Hobbit expected me to stop living. They didn't say it, but they expected it. I listened quietly. They thought loving someone once meant I couldn't have another chapter. Her voice was calm. But life doesn't work that way. She looked at me then, directly, honestly. I don't know what this is becoming, neither do I. But I know one thing. What? I don't feel guilty when I'm with you. The words should have made everything easier. Instead, they made everything real. I looked at the garden, the flowers, the old house, the woman sitting beside me. And for the first time, I admitted something to myself. I wasn't coming here because I enjoyed gardening. I wasn't coming because I needed fresh vegetables. I wasn't even coming because I liked the conversations. I was coming because somewhere along the way, a quiet Saturday morning with Margaret had become the best part of my week, and I had no idea what I was supposed to do about that. A week later, the rain arrived before I did. The sky was gray, the roads were wet. By the time I pulled into Margaret's driveway, the garden was already impossible to work in. She opened the front door before I could knock. I was beginning to think you'd chosen the sensible option. I considered it, and I remembered you probably had coffee. She smiled. I do. And cinnamon cake. I looked impressed. You planned this. I always bake when it rains. She stepped aside. Come in. The house was warm. It smelled of fresh coffee, old books, and something cooking slowly in the kitchen. I had been inside once or twice during my marriage, but it felt different now, less like visiting someone's family, more like being invited into someone's life. She hung my wet jacket near the door. You still forget umbrellas. I've never owned a good one. Your generation has strange priorities. My generation? She raised an eyebrow. You make me feel very old sometimes. I smiled. I was about to say exactly the opposite. A faint blush touched her face. She turned toward the kitchen. Sit down. I'll pretend not to hear flattery. We carried our coffee into the living room. A fire burned quietly in the fireplace. Books covered almost every wall. Family photographs stood on a wooden shelf. I noticed one of Claire as a little girl, another of Margaret and her husband standing beside a boat, and one empty space. A picture had once been there. The frame remained, the photograph was gone. Margaret followed my eyes. I moved it. I looked at her. Why? She sat down across from me. Because I kept looking at it, and I realized I was looking backwards so often that I wasn't seeing what was right in front of me. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The whole house seemed wrapped in quiet. She handed me a slice of cinnamon cake. I should warn you. What? If you say it's good, I'll make you take half of it home. I tasted it. It was honestly one of the best things I had ever eaten. I sighed. This is a disaster. Her eyes widened. That bad? No. I laughed. Now I'm going to expect this every time I visit. The word escaped before I thought about it. Visit. Not help in the garden. Not stop by. Visit. Margaret heard it too. She looked down at her coffee cup. I like that word. So do I. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It felt safe. Outside, the rain grew heavier. Margaret stood and walked to the window. When I was younger, I thought life would always make sense. She looked out at the garden. I thought there would be rules. If you loved someone, you loved only them. If something ended, it stayed ended. She turned toward me. But life keeps surprising you. I stood up. Walked over to the window. We stood side by side watching the rain fall over the garden. Neither of us spoke. Then she said very quietly, Ethan, yes, if someone had told me a year ago that a rainy afternoon and a cup of coffee could make me this happy, I wouldn't have believed them. I looked at her, really looked at her, and in that quiet little house, with rain against the windows and cinnamon in the air, I realized I wasn't afraid of what people might think anymore. I was only afraid that one day, this might end. It happened on a Thursday evening. I was finishing paperwork at the office when my phone rang. Margaret, she almost never called. We usually texted, I answered immediately. Hello? Her voice was calm, too calm. Claire is coming home this weekend. I leaned back in my chair. Oh, I thought you should know. I looked out the office window. The streets below were already dark. How does she feel? Margaret was quiet for a moment. I don't think she knows yet. And you? A small laugh escaped her. I thought I was too old to be nervous. You aren't nervous. No? No. I smiled to myself. You're just someone who cares about the people involved. She didn't answer because she knew I was right. Saturday arrived colder than expected. The garden could wait. The roses could wait. Everything suddenly felt like it was waiting. I spent the morning trying to work. I rewrote the same report 3 times. At lunchtime, I gave up. I made coffee. It tasted terrible. Margaret would have said I was rushing it. Around 3 in the afternoon, my phone vibrated. Margaret, she's here. I stared at the message, then another one arrived. I don't want you to worry, which, naturally, made me worry. The next morning, I was repairing a loose fence panel in my own garden when I heard a car stop outside. I looked up. Claire stepped out. For a second, neither of us moved. 3 years had passed. She looked happy, older somehow, more certain of herself. Ethan, hi, Claire. She smiled a little. I hope this isn't a bad time. I was losing a fight with a fence. She looked at the broken wood. You always did pick exciting hobbies. I laughed. Some things don't disappear. She walked into the garden. I wanted to see you. I guessed. A breeze moved through the trees. She folded her hands together. Told me. I nodded. Neither of us pretended not to understand. She looked down at the grass. I was angry. I know, I wasn't angry because of you. I stayed quiet. I think she searched for the words. I was angry because life isn't supposed to work like this. No, it probably isn't. She smiled sadly. But our marriage wasn't supposed to end either. The truth of that sat quietly between us. She looked at me. Are you happy? I wasn't expecting the question. I thought about rainy afternoons. Coffee Garden's old books. A woman who had taught me that flowers don't like being tied too tightly. Then I answered honestly, yes. Claire closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them again, she was smiling. Good. She took a slow breath. I love my life in Seattle. I love the person I'm with. And I love my mother. She looked directly at me. I don't want either of you spending the rest of your lives feeling guilty. I felt something loosen inside my chest. She laughed softly. You know what's strange? What? I always thought the two kindest people I knew would become friends. She shook her head. I just never imagined they would fall in love. I couldn't answer, because somewhere deep down, I knew she had already guessed the truth. The only people who still hadn't said it out loud were Margaret and me. 3 days after, Claire visited me. Margaret called. Would you like to come for dinner? I smiled. I thought I was already invited every time it rained. You've become very confident. I've been practicing. She laughed, the real laugh, the one that always made her seem 10 years younger. Come at 7. When I arrived, the porch light was already on. The garden looked different. The roses had started to bloom again. The apple trees moved gently in the evening breeze. Margaret opened the door before I knocked. She looked at me for a second, then she smiled. You're early. I didn't want to be late. I made too much food. I was hoping you had. She stepped aside. Come in. The house felt warm, comfortable, like it had been expecting me. Dinner was simple soup, fresh bread, vegetables from the garden, coffee afterward. We talked about ordinary things. A new family had moved into the old cottage down the road. The library was replacing its windows. The tomato plants were finally behaving themselves. Neither of us mentioned Claire. Neither of us mentioned the past. When the dishes were finished, Margaret carried 2 mugs of coffee onto the back porch. The sun was setting beyond the garden. Everything was quiet. She sat beside me. Claire called. I looked at her. She told me she visited you. She did. Margaret smiled softly. She said something I wasn't expecting. What? She said. Margaret looked out across the roses. Mom, you've spent enough years taking care of everyone else. A small tear appeared in her eye. I think it's your turn to be happy. I didn't say anything. Some moments deserve silence. She laughed quietly and wiped her eyes. You know, I used to think life gave us one great love story. And now, she looked at me. I think life gives us chances. Some people miss them. Some people are too afraid. And some people, she smiled, meet their ex-son-in-law while arguing with apples. I laughed. I still think those apples were suspicious. They absolutely were. The evening light faded. The garden slowly disappeared into shadow. Margaret reached for my hand, not carefully, not uncertainly, just naturally. I've been wanting to ask you something. What? That first morning, why did you walk over? I thought about the answer. The truth was simple. I saw someone standing alone, and I had a feeling that if I walked away, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. She squeezed my hand gently. I'm very glad you stayed. I looked at the little garden, the old house, the woman beside me, then I smiled. So am I. A cool breeze carried the smell of roses through the evening air. The porch light came on behind us. The front door was still open. And I realized something. People think love is always loud, that it arrives all at once, that it changes your life in a single dramatic moment. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it begins with a basket of apples, a cup of coffee, a rainy afternoon, and two people who discover that the best chapters of their lives were waiting for them much later than they ever expected. And together, we went back inside because some doors are meant to stay open.